think it's the second one, right, Courtney? And those are very engaging. And on third, so with the goal, and this has been our goal for quite a while, to release a policy, a draft of the policy document, policy framework in June, probably the end of June, where, oh, thanks. Todd's telling me that I'm scraping on my turtleneck there. To release a document at the end of June. So we are gearing up for that. This week, Thursday, we will be presenting to the Chicago Plan Commission just of where we are at. And I'm thankful for all of the co-chair members and even advisory committee, CACHA members for be willing to attend that meeting and just give the plan commissioners a brief overview or idea of what is striking them about the process so far. So we will have actually 8 speakers and myself to give them an update on where we are and give them this timeline as well. The next slide.
Yeah, also just note on this timeline so you all can see, right now we're at meeting 7. Next month is meeting 8. And then for meeting 9 in April, you'll be hearing from the pillar co-chairs again. They'll do a report out to you all, the advisory committee, for the work of their team, specifically on the policy recommendations front. So we're excited for, again, that moment to get input from all of you as you are sort of looking across the board, across all the pillars, helping us identify what might be missing, what we need to lift up. So looking forward to that.
So the next slide. So just to recap, all the teams started with a guiding question, have moved on to objectives and policies. And right now, in DPD, we are looking at the guiding questions and the objectives, getting them ready for a wider public audience, which means we will be doing some editing on those, and we plan to review all of those edits with all of the co-chairs starting maybe even Wednesday, just to make sure that the editing doesn't lose any of the intent. But as we go into much broader engagement, we are going to need to kind of clarify the language a bit for people who haven't had the benefit of being in these meetings and having these conversations and really spend a lot of time thinking about what we're phrasing here. So we will be doing that and sharing that. And we will have a lot of content. So in June, we will have a lot of content. If you're going to do the math of this, we'll see a lot of policy ideas for objectives and pillars. So then summer, again, we're going to be finished, I think it's the end of June. Courtney's thinking of some kind of, can we all get together activity for our last meeting, depending on where the world is at that time. And then we intend to start broad outreach pretty much through the release of that report to the holiday season before Thanksgiving, and the wide variety of activities, which we're just beginning to scope now. Next slide. So the engagement update, we have, as I said, co-chairs presenting the plan commission, which I think is really important because that's actually seeing the engagement and listening to the people who are engaged, the people that are really deep into the engagement. We will be doing some pillar-specific briefings to city council committee. So we just had an initial conversation with 2 committee chairs, one for workforce and one for environment. And so environment, for example, we probably want to go, generally, here's what's happening with the plan and talk about what's being developed in environment, climate, and energy. And then for workforce, that actually we're finding, I believe, in 3 pillars: lifelong learning, economic development, and arts and culture. So that might be something where we talk about 3 different pillars in a specific cross-pillar topic. And so we will also be talking to other city council committee chairs, transportation, for example, and trying to have basically a public hearing, just getting their input and getting them up to speed on where we have been over the last year and a half. As I said, we're editing the work so far to be able to launch a public survey on the objectives and the guiding questions, hopefully by late March. And we do want to make that survey very easy for people to fill out, meaning that if there's some kind of scale, right? So there's a question and you can either, choose or rank or rate different objectives. So it's very easy for people to go through. And that would probably be by pillar. So people could either do all of the pillars or, do the pillars that they're most interested in. So as I said, we will be expanding the engagement team, both internally in DPD. We are talking to people, interviewing people for assistance for Gabby in the communications department, as well as getting some kind of resources, some kind of consultant resources to do street teams, street ambassadors, so that we really are at all of the events, especially all the events, for example, that DK's is holding this summer, tabling at all of those, doing other types of activities across the city, and using some of the techniques that our artist organizers were working with this past year. And that's the schedule. Pretty much we end in June. The most work here ends in June. And now the rest of the city, how many people can we contact? How many people can have input on the plan in that period of time? And the engagement is what we want to talk about with you today.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. I think there was a little background noise picking up, but I think I caught everything. I think if folks have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat if any of that didn't come through. So as Kathy teed up, we want to spend the bulk of this meeting with you all today discussing accessible and meaningful community engagement. For the next 15 or maybe 20 minutes or so, Skyler and I are going to go over a set of level setting slides, both recapping, highlighting some of the advanced reading that we shared out with you all, as well as highlighting some examples of how other cities have incorporated engagement recommendations into their citywide plan too. The background or the context for this is also that later in the agenda, we want to spend dedicated time with you all to help us develop and refine and actually have or develop specific objectives and eventually policy recommendations for engagement to include as part of the We Will Chicago final citywide plan. So all of this is a little bit of level setting to get to that breakout. Now, to begin with what's on the slide, one of the advanced reading materials that we sent out to you all was the MPC pre-planning report. I believe we sent it out to you all before, and as I believe you all know, accessible and meaningful community engagement is one of the core 5 themes that that is a part of We Will Chicago and that we are striving to center throughout the entire process. The recommendations within this MPC report were specifically for how we structure or try to achieve this theme or this goal of accessible community engagement inside or throughout the We Will Chicago planning process. And we also felt like that was it's a good reflection of the kinds of recommendations that we want to put out there or keep in mind as we develop more specific recommendations for the citywide plan itself too. So it's not directly one-to-one examples, but really good inspiration and ideas for how to start thinking about similar recommendations for We Will. The next slide that we have also highlights another advanced reading that we sent out to you all. This one coming from Elevated Chicago and the amazing work that went into developing a set of community engagement principles and recommendations. There are a number of things, a number of recommendations and principles throughout that report that are not on this slide, but one thing we did want to highlight and elevate is this spectrum of public participation. And so this was adapted from the International Association for Public Participation, and it shows the spectrum moving from inform to consult, to involve, collaborate, ultimately to empower and own. So really just, we wanted to offer this as another framework for how we think about the different levels of community engagement or the different goals of public participation. In some cases, it might just be informing. In the ideal state, there's empowering and ownership that is also going on, where the promise that we're making to the public is that I'm looking at the spectrum on the slide now, where the promise that we make to the public, for example, under own is we will provide or transfer full or partial ownership of this project to you. So I also want to keep this spectrum in mind as we start going into some of our brainstorming and ideation around. Cool. All right, if we go to the next slide, the last advanced pre-reading that we shared with you all were related to engagement specific or engagement related objectives that are currently being developed by the Pillar research teams. So another bit of context here is that we're seeing this theme of accessible and meaningful community engagement coming up across Pillar teams, coming up in conversations around housing and neighborhoods, around transportation infrastructure, environment, climate, and energy. And so we also recognize that there is some similarities or parallels across these recommendations that we also wanted to share with you all and begin to think about how we elevate this to be a separate part or potentially a designated set of recommendations within We Will Chicago. So just to highlight a couple of these examples that have come up from the Pillar teams, you can see it on the slide, but this one from the Housing and Neighborhoods team is to engage historically marginalized residents and stakeholders in neighborhood decisions and processes. Another example from the Transportation and Infrastructure team is to promote collaboration and coordination among all city departments and partners responsible for transportation and infrastructure to ensure actions are aligned with community input. And then the last example we have also from Housing and Neighborhoods is around establishing transparent decision-making procedures. So this is just, these are just three of several recommendations related to engagement that are coming, or objectives related to engagement that are coming through from the Pillar research teams. And you can reference that document for the entire list too. Great, and so with some of those level setting pieces in mind, we also want to offer a few examples of how other cities have similarly incorporated engagement principles within their citywide plan. So the first example we have for you is from Edmonton. The way that they structured their citywide plan, they had guiding values and then what they call outcomes. And so here we have a couple examples that are relevant to engagement. The first being this around this value of I want to belong and to contribute, with the outcome then related to that value being Edmontonians can connect, be active in their community, and celebrate Edmonton's heritage, diversity, and unique identity. The second value example here is that I want to be able to create and innovate. And one related outcome or objective under that value was that Edmonton fosters citizen leadership, capacity building, and co-creation. So these are just a couple of examples for us to have in mind, or for you all to have in mind as we start thinking about relevant recommendations for the city of Chicago.
Yeah, thanks, Juan Sebastian. This next example that we have is from the city of Minneapolis. This one gets much more specific about civic participation as a component of their citywide plan. So they frame it as an equitable civic participation system. So you can see their quick blurb or narrative. It's really focusing on civic participation that enfranchises people, recognizing the core vital service of neighborhood organizations, and then the builds people's long-term capacity to organize and improve their lives and neighborhoods. So I'll highlight just a couple of their specific policy recommendations that they elevated. You can see the full list here. What they mean by public services policy, if we double click on that one, it's the city will seek to accomplish the following action steps to provide services that benefit residents, workers, visitors, and businesses in a streamlined and accessible manner, such as housing inspections, development review, health inspections, 311, and business licensing. So they're really considering this as like, what are the touch points and actual intersections between residents and the city on a day-to-day basis, and how can they make sure that those are as streamlined and accessible as possible? Another example in their portfolio is technology and the city enterprise use. So they actually use this to talk about the way that the city should be making information and decision-making processes transparent, providing decision makers with real-time, high-integrity data on which to make decisions. So a lot of this relates to both their internal operations and how they use data to drive their decisions, but then also the make that information accessible to the everyday, accessible and usable for the everyday public as well. Another great example is from the city of New York, which we can see on the next slide. So New York is, like many other cities, they're tackling this theme from the frame focused on democratic engagement and civic participation and building trust. So you can see some of the calling out the vibrant democracy as a specific strategy within their plan. So for them, this was a sort of standalone pillar, if you will. From all of the bullets here, just give you a sense of a double click on one of these, empowering all New Yorkers to participate in their democracy. So for them, that is their overarching objective. And within it, they have a number of concrete policy recommendations. So as an example for that one, they have expanding voting rights and representation to bring more New Yorkers to the polls. They have expanding opportunities for democratic engagement. And so this might look like participatory budgeting, language interpreters at poll sites, developing a citywide community engagement strategy. They also have recommendations around increasing digital literacy to combat misinformation and hate speech threatening democracy. And lastly, empowering the next generation of New Yorkers to become informed residents and activists. So within that, they talk about some focus point around civics education and community organizing education for youth. So as you can see, sort of it really runs the gamut, and we're excited to dive into some of these pathways that we know are so, really cross-cutting. And this speaks directly to the function of the advisory committee to be thinking about this overarching sort of civic infrastructure and accessibility and transparency in the relationship between residents and access to city services. So we're excited about all the ways that you'll customize this as a menu for Chicago itself. On the next slide, you can see what we mean, I'm teeing up our activity that we're going to launch into today. So what do we mean by objectives and policies? So before we jump in, let's outline the difference between the two. So on a very high level, objectives define what we want to achieve, while policies describe how we are going to achieve it. So objectives are the outcomes we want to accomplish through We Will Chicago, and define the specific measurable actions that the city must take to support or fulfill the guiding question that we're trying to answer. So policies, on the other hand, they're a lot more specific. They're the how. They're the set of actions that we'll take to fulfill an objective. So policies are specific recommendations that will consider trade-offs, different approaches, but the larger objective is the same for all of them. So to give you a visual, all of our teams within We Will Chicago and the pillars are developing a set of 3 to 4 different objectives. And within them, there's a double click on 3 to 5 policies that they are seeking to implement in order to achieve that objective. To give you a really concrete example, we have one more slide. So this specifically is an example using equitable representation in city elections as a sample guiding question, right? So let's talk through how we might answer the guiding question of how do we ensure an equitable representation of Black and Brown Chicagoans in city elections? Specifically, this is around sort of voting participation. So one example objective could be increase voter turnout among Black and Brown residents in city elections. The what we are identifying as voter turnout, the outcome we want to achieve is a measurable increase in voter turnout amongst Black and Brown residents. And so that would be an example of an objective. Now, the response, an increased use of voting by mail in Black and Brown neighborhoods, is not an objective. Voting by mail is a how. So it's a very specific action that can be implemented to increase voter turnout. So that's more of a policy. So today in our discussions, we're really going to be focusing on the development of objectives. So try to always remind yourself to be at that level up and think of something under which a set of policy recommendations will come. This is a 2-part series. So today we're really going to be focusing on the objectives to align on some of the higher order goals. And then in the next meeting in the month of March, we're going to dive into more of the policy recommendations. But we know in the course of these conversations, oftentimes ideas will come up that are policy recommendations. So our facilitators will prompt us to like think about things more broadly in a banner. But if you're offering a policy recommendation, we will put it in a parking lot today and make sure we don't lose those great, very specific ideas, because we know that, you know, between the start of this conversation today and the meeting next month, we'll have a lot of new ideas that emerge in between. So we're excited to embark on this process of exploration with all of you. Any questions? I know, Courtney, you're gonna more specifically tee up our actual activity. But before we dive into that, any questions?
Maureen had one, but I think you answered it, but want to make sure, Maureen, that makes sense, that today we'll begin with the what, and then we'll get to the how. So it seems like an unnatural division, but it's like a process so that we can make sure we focus on one piece and then follow it up with the other.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I think what we found interesting in looking at other cities is the language they use, you know, the kind of hierarchy of ideas. Is it values? Is it objectives or outcomes? And so that's something we've been thinking about, but have found the guiding questions to objectives to policy framework to be a very thorough process.
This is Rafael.
Mhm.
I have a question. This is a great approach in terms of getting community engagement. My basic question is, how are we going to engage the private sector on this? Because we can talk about community development, community engagement, but if we don't have the participation of the private sector to make that happen, I'm afraid that it will be a report that will be shelved.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Rafael. A couple responses, and it does relate also to Ellen's question in the chat. So specifically, we, as we do this activity today, we are thinking about authentic and meaningful community engagement for the city overall. So all sort of public decision-making process, policy-making processes, these are not recommendations only for We Will Chicago. We're really thinking across the board, departments, sister agencies. So think big today. And then Rafael, to your question, you know, you're speaking specifically to what might be a limitation within our own We Will Chicago process to date. I will acknowledge, even through our open call of volunteer applications for the respective pillar research teams and for the advisory committee, there are people who do belong to the private sector who are part of those conversations. So we hope that they're bringing some of that lens into the process of creating objectives and policy recommendations. We also recognize, though, that there is value sometimes in more dedicated stakeholder focus groups or sector-based focus groups. So that is a tactic that we're exploring and hope to iron out as we develop our community engagement plan from June until December, to acknowledge like what are the specific subpopulations or communities that we haven't yet engaged enough in the process by nature of the fact that they aren't as represented in some of these volunteer groups that we did an open application around. And so an example of that, there's not a lot of focus right now in the plan related to, you know, specific industry clusters. And so if we decided that we needed to convene a focus group that was with, you know, restaurants from all over the city to better learn how we might support the ecosystem of that industry, you know, that could be a decision that we have for our engagement between June to December to really shore that up in the plan. I will note that this plan is not a traditional economic development plan. And so there's a lot of other citywide plans that have actually tackled the growth and evolution of various industry clusters. The Chicago Recovery Plan, the Recovery Task Force a couple years ago tackled that very thing around specific industries such as healthcare, caregiving, and thinking about the evolution of media and film, our plan is not going to get super, super granular around specific industries, but thinking about the city overall and economic development for vibrant business communities, vibrant small BIPOC owned businesses. These are all principles that I think you'll see come to bear when we actually start to share out some of the recommendations with you. But I would love, Raphael, if you keep that hat on, particularly as we walk into this conversation, and just think about that perspective that might be missing. And if you have that hat on, what might we add to this conversation that we feel like would address that need? But definitely noted on the need to make sure that we're incorporating that community among many other communities that haven't engaged in We Will so far, because we know that that's a lot of people in the everyday public that still have not heard about this plan and had an opportunity to provide input. And we're excited to bridge that gap in the months to come alongside you.
Thank you.
This is Kathy. I would just add, and I should have done this earlier, that we are looking at a central city update, right? So for the central area, which is also a gap that we have. We don't have a lot of participation or even focus on that area. And so this work is really kind of the base for the whole city. And as we go into those other plans, we would bring this kind of perspective and process to it. So yeah, as Skyler said, we have a lot of groups in all different ways that we are going to need to outreach, particularly to in this period from June through November.
I think Gabby had a question or comment.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to mention that, well, as there's kind of been a few questions about engagement for, what is We Will versus engagement that's actually going into city policy. And I just wanted to uplift that what we've seen as we've been editing kind of all of these pillar recommendations, from all 7 pillars, it keeps rising to the top, like community involvement in public decision making. And so what we're trying to do here with this group today is how do we standardize that across all city kind of agencies, across city departments, so that we don't see people in housing getting more involved than people in transportation decisions than this, so that we're really having just standardized ideas about what is appropriate levels of engagement for any types of city projects and decisions that are happening. So I think that's just a good way to go into this, and your brainstorming is thinking across all 7 pillars. We've seen a lot of these kinds of comments, and what we want to try to do is how do we standardize that across the entire We Will plan.
Any other questions before I start to describe the activity? Okay, so we shared engagement-related objectives that have bubbled up from the pillars. And today and in March, we want to mimic the process that the pillar research teams have undergone to get to objectives and a policy framework. Their charge was mostly to think about their topic. I don't think it was a surprise that some of the objectives related to engagement, but we realize engagement is bigger than any one pillar. So we've shared the ones that have come from the pillar research teams as source material. We shared what we mean by objective and policy framework. We shared examples from other cities. So we hope all of this is combining with your own ideas and experiences with how you would like to improve engagement in the city, outside of the plan, as part of the plan, all fair game. So that's what we want to do today. So with the engagement related objectives that came from pillar research teams, we sort of backed into 2 guiding questions. One of which is, how can we increase transparency in decision-making processes? And the other is, how can we increase community involvement in decision-making processes? So we're going to break up into 2 groups, each of us tackling one of those guiding questions and the related objectives that we have so far. The task is really to add to that. So this is very much a working session, beginning with brainstorming. Nothing will be lost if we as a group see that a particular idea is perhaps more of a policy than an objective. That's fine. We have a place for it. We won't lose it. In between this meeting in March, the team will do some kind of synthesizing and light refining, not changing any of the spirit or intent, but taking all of the good ideas that come out of today and bringing it back for a follow-up conversation in March that we would then pivot towards a policy framework. So don't hold back, because even though today's goal is to get to objectives, soon enough, we'll be talking about policy. So we want all of it. We just wanted to be clear for ourselves and for the activity, this difference between the what and the how, because we will ultimately need both. Let's see if I've missed anything. So yeah, we're gonna spend a good chunk of time today because we realize this is important and needs time to get those ideas out and then to gel as a group on each of these important questions. So we'll have a chunk of time today, even 50 minutes or so. And then we will come back just to check in on how the process was and to see what emerged. Anything else from the team before we send people on their way?
Maybe
All right.
just to actually show the questions on the slide for people to absorb.
Yes, thank you. So one group is going to stay in the main breakout room, and then the other half of participants will go into another breakout. We will be using a Google Doc. You are invited to type directly in it, or we have a scribe who can scribe verbal comments. So whichever way is more comfortable for you to participate, you are invited, but the facilitator will walk you through all of that once we're in our groups. All right.
Thank you.
So the other group is going to join us. Just checking the chat one more time. Lots of good conversations in there, and we will incorporate anything that's relevant to the Google Doc. It's not already in there. Let me get this together. Allie, do we have your group back?
Yes, I believe so.
Do you have a couple of people who might share a reflection on the process today and any top objectives that emerged? We found ourselves, we spent a lot of time on transparency issue, but found ourselves creeping towards the question you guys were answering. So happy to bring everyone together and hear about it.
We had an amazing conversation, and sort of the end of our conversation went toward transparency. So it's a very good dovetail for this. We did not name anyone to volunteer, but I'm going to ask Cliff Helm if he'd like to share back some reflections.
Sure. I think we had a mix of very direct examples that we were talking about in terms of community engagement and in terms of what people expect from the city and how the city, like how harms from the city really directly impact them and what we can do about that. All the way sort of broader to the more abstract questions of what is the underlying goal of community engagement, and even what is the underlying goal of the We Will Chicago plan as a whole. And I think we had a very wide range of things that went between all of that. So that was broadly.
I'm recalling we have some people who might need to drop. So I'm going to ask Deepa to share reflections from our process, and then we can maybe go back and forth on some of the specific objectives that were shared today.
Thank you. So I think as a whole, as a group, we had a pretty conversation about how the processes perhaps aren't clearly marked out because there isn't a consistency that exists across the different departments and the different stakeholders who are looking at different initiatives. So there was this whole idea of, if we're going to manage something that allows for greater transparency, how do we first make sure that those steps are clear? How do we disseminate that information and get it to a range of residents across the city through a lot of different channels? And then how do we actually encourage people to be engaged with providing feedback once they have that understanding? And so when we look at some of the things that came up, we had a pretty big discussion about, is it more people, or is it more dedicated roles, or is it a difference in the way in which we're engaging with networks of community-based organizations, residents, existing government employees, to come together to say, how do we make it easier and safer and more accessible for a number of different residents and groups across the city to engage on different topics and outcomes that we want to have. And so there was a discussion about, is that more people, is it different roles, and good examples given about how some of the city departments are thinking differently about the ways in which they're engaging in community, how generally the idea of smaller government has perhaps limited our ability to invest in people to do this work in a dedicated manner. And then the last piece of it was around just the data that we do have available about what's being done. Is there, have we really used to the greatest extent technologies to both disseminate information, capture data, make it more transparent through things like the Chicago Data Portal or other mechanisms? And what's the play between human connectivity to activate information that's provided in digital tools like that, and then actually just putting that infrastructure in that allows us to have the processes clearly laid out in a place that's publicly available, so we're held accountable to what we're trying to do and whether or not we've achieved those goals on behalf of the residents of the city.
Thank you,
I don't know,
Deepa.
Courtney, if that helped.
Definitely. Isabelle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just the only thing was that I think our group wanted to put a fine point on was talking about government and building trust and limitations of government. I think it was government as a city service and government as a political body. So barriers to transparency because of that, and sort of teasing that out and talking about how trust building and transparency and community engagement, they all have to happen all together in order to be effective. I think Deepa put everything else in the reflection very well.
Anything else from the other group, or anyone who wants to share a reflection or a specific objective that stood out to you? I think we're going to take all of this good stuff and bring it back in March. I'm thinking we leave both Google Docs open and available to everyone, so you could contribute. We'll email them out with a deadline so that there's still time to kind of synthesize and refine and bring back for March. But any other comments, questions, reflections before we begin to close?
Yeah, just acknowledging, I think a lot of very similar themes came out in that the other group that I was not in, and there's so many echoes that it'll be important for the facilitators to just like take a step back, absorb all of the content, and then see where there might be some like distinct pathways versus sort of synergies across both of these. In our group, just to call out, like there was a couple really poignant elements around, ensuring that we, like, in the service of what, in the service of empowering residents who are most impacted by a decision to impact that decision. And so that kind of spoke for our group, step back and ground ourselves in values. And so we might want to do some work around even pulling some of the principles from the elevated framework around like what authentic and meaningful engagement looks like, and then actually have some of our recommendations speak to operationalizing those principles and values. as one pathway for future work for us to think about. So appreciate our group for always prompting the why, you know, and I think particularly as we're refining policy recommendations in both around transparency and accessibility, that'll be a good prompt for all of us to always be asking that so we can get as specific as possible here. But really grateful for the conversation today.
Agreed. All right, Skyler, do you want to preview what's coming next?
Yeah, so I just mentioned Courtney we will keep the Google Docs alive. So I know some of us may need a little bit more processing time, want to mull over some of the pieces. Our group had a lot of policy recommendations and less objectives. So if folks with fresh eyes want to be doing a little bit more work, again, we'll keep the documents open. Our charge for the next meeting, we'll do some sort of synthesis, reflections on what we heard, and then we'll come back and probably we'll need to consensus check on the objectives where we landed today. And then we'll start to dive into more of the policy conversation. So excited for that time together. Next time we will tee up the equity and resiliency data dashboard. So I think we've mentioned this in past meetings, but this is going to be a companion project that we release simultaneously with the citywide plan, where folks would be able to dive in sort of geographically in neighborhoods and citywide to look at a number of key metrics or data measures across all of the pillars of the citywide plan as an even further manifestation of our values around accessible data, around transparent data, and then holding ourselves accountable. If this is, you know, if we look at the map and see what our trends are on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, those are the data that we need to hold true and track against over time to know whether or not our plan is being successful in implementation to reverse the trends of inequity and climate change in our city. The last piece I'll note is the pillar co-chairs will be coming in April. So I know a couple of you, we haven't met for some time. We skipped January. So it's always just helpful for us to ground in the why of this work. You all are doing a historic feat with us, right? We haven't had a citywide plan since the 60s. Citywide plans are these visionary documents in which we are collectively looking across major quality of life drivers for the everyday lives of residents and saying, this is what we think needs to change, and engaging more and more people in that conversation throughout the course of this year. And so just to reflect, like, this is a really energizing project in a lot of ways. Today's conversation substantiates that very fact that, all of us in this meeting today and the meeting next time, we're going to be looking across the board at all of the pillars and developing these community engagement recommendations. And then again, in April, you'll have an opportunity to hear the really granular policy recommendations that are starting to emerge within each of the pillars. So if you're particularly interested in transportation and infrastructure, don't worry, you'll have time in April for you to hear what's emerging in the pillars. And then again, the valuable role that you all play as an advisory committee is really looking across all the pillars and thinking, what is missing when I read everything in totality? And that'll be one of the critical last checks before we have a draft plan available starting after this June phase wraps up. So excited for the next couple meetings ahead, where it feels like we're at a bit of a finish line, but only to set us up for stronger community engagement to really gut check and the plan in the months ahead. So grateful for you to be on this journey with us. And with that, I'll kick it to Courtney.
Yeah, it's really just can enjoy the rest of your day, or we'll hang around if there's any questions or comments. And thanks for the kind comments in the chat.
Thank you, everyone.